Shalom, I'm Eddie Chumney of Hebraic Heritage Ministries, and we welcome you to this week's Focus Israel Report. In this week's report, we're going to look at the current status of the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. First, we're going to share with you an overview of what we're going to be covering in this week's report. Recently, envoys from the International Peacekeeping Quartet, consisting of the United States, the European Union, Russia, and the United Nations, had meetings with Israeli and Palestinian officials in an effort to restart direct negotiations between them. However, those efforts failed, but the United States nevertheless called the talks constructive and announced that the next round of meetings would be in mid-December. Israel is interested in starting direct negotiations with the Palestinians without preconditions. However, Palestinians say that as long as Israel continues the policy of building homes in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, that a two-state solution is incompatible with this policy. As a result, Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas said that there are no signs that negotiations with Israel will be resumed in the near future. In addition to Israel agreeing to suspend building homes in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, Palestinian condition for the resumption of peace talks with Israel is that Israel must agree that the outcome of the talks will be a Palestinian state based upon 67 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital. On September the 23rd, Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas submitted a request to the United Nations Security Council for there to be a recognition of a Palestinian state based upon 67 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital by the United Nations. However, the United Nations Security Council has refused to accept this request. As a result, the Palestinians have decided to seek the following strategy. Number one, they will look to have acceptance of a Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as its capital by the UN General Assembly. This is something that is expected to be passed with the likely support of France and Britain. The other area that the Palestinians are pursuing is to establish a unity government between Fatah, which is headed by Mahmoud Abbas, and Hamas, whose leadership is in the Gaza Strip. A Palestinian unity government had previously been agreed upon by Fatah and Hamas earlier in the year. However, the terms in which this agreement was to be implemented has not fully been resolved. One of the major sticking points was Fatah's insistence that current Palestinian Prime Minister Salam Fayyad would be a part of this unity government. This has been opposed by Hamas. However, the United States and Europe would like to see Salam Fayyad in any future Palestinian unity government. In order for the United States and Europe to accept a unity government of Fatah and Hamas, they insist that Hamas must accept international agreements, recognize Israel, and accept the terms of peace negotiations set forth by the quartet. Senior Palestinian negotiator Saeb Erekat stated that reconciliation with Hamas is a top priority of Mahmoud Abbas. Ahmed Youssef, a political advisor to Hamas's Prime Minister Ismail Haniyeh, said that the next Palestinian government will be headquartered in the Gaza. In response to the Palestinians' effort to organize a unity government, Israel has decided to freeze taxed money that is intended to go to the Palestinians from the signing of the 1993 Oslo Accords. The Israel position is they do not want to be funding a Palestinian government who seeks its destruction, as is the stated words of Hamas toward Israel. Meanwhile, the United States is pressing Israel Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to release these frozen Palestinian tax funds. However, Israel has stated that they are unable to do so because the senior cabinet of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is not willing to unfreeze the funds as long as the Palestinians are seeking a unity government between Hamas and Fatah. UN General Secretary Ban Ki-moon also called upon Israel to hand over the tax money to the Palestinians. Given that the United States and Europe does not support a Palestinian unity government as long as Hamas refuses to recognize Israel and agree to terms of negotiations with Israel as outlined by the quartet, Jordan's King Abdullah had an urgent meeting in Ramallah with Mahmoud Abbas regarding this issue. Abdullah shared with Abbas the concerns of the United States and Europe regarding the ramifications of Fatah agreeing to a unity government with Hamas. In an effort to express their concern for the agreement to set up this unity government between Fatah and Hamas, U.S. Under Secretary of State William Burns made a visit to the Middle East and talked with both Israel Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas. Burns warned Mahmoud Abbas that should he go forward and agree to set up a unity government with Hamas, that the United States and West Europe will cut ties with the Palestinians, and they will not be forgiven for agreeing to a government with Hamas while not demanding that Hamas accepts the conditions for peace talks with Israel as set forth by the quartet. The United States and the European Union is concerned that an agreement to establish a unity government between Fatah and Hamas will strengthen Syria and Iran. The U.S. envoy William Burns left his meeting with the Palestinians without a final answer from them. In his meeting with the Palestinians regarding Fatah and Hamas unity talks, Jordan's King Abdullah expressed his support for the Palestinians' effort to establish an independent state in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip with East Jerusalem as its capital, but also tried to persuade the Palestinians to do this through direct negotiations with Israel. In an effort to try to persuade the Palestinians to restart direct peace talks with Israel, it is reported that Jordan's King Abdullah presented Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas with a document that included a European proposal for the Palestinians to start direct peace talks with Israel without demanding a settlement freeze in the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Israel, in exchange for the European promise to support a Palestinian state at the UN in a year from now if negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians failed by the end of 2012. So this is a summary of what we're going to be covering in this week's report. Now let's look at some of the details of these articles. Because the quartet, consisting of the United States, the European Union, Russia, and the United Nations, has been unable to persuade Israel and the Palestinians to resume direct peace talks, and as a result of the United Nations Security Council rejecting the submission of the Palestinians for recognition of a Palestinian state based upon 67 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital, the Palestinians are now considering submitting a new proposal to the United Nations General Assembly within weeks. The article from the British Telegraph says, the United Nations General Assembly could be asked to admit the Palestinian Authority as a non-member state within weeks, after officials in the West Bank conceded that their bid to win full statehood through the UN Security Council has not been approved. The Palestinians are all but guaranteed to secure the majority they need in the General Assembly, but hope that they could win support of key European states such as France and Britain. Recognition through the United Nations General Assembly would give the Palestinians a status similar to the status that the Catholic Church has in the United Nations. Although no decision has yet been made, a Palestinian official said a resolution could be tabled before the General Assembly meets on November the 29th, when it traditionally discusses Palestinian issues. Regarding this possibility, French Consul General in Israel, Frederic Desagneau, announced that his country was ready to work with Palestinian UN representatives to present a resolution to the General Assembly on the issue of a Palestinian state. He also said France would continue supporting the Palestinian Authority with a transfer of 10 million euros to them by the end of November. From Haaretz.com, the headline reads, Fatah and Hamas agreed to establish a caretaker government without current Palestinian Prime Minister Salam Fayyad being a part of it. Rival Palestinian factions Fatah and Hamas agreed to hold elections in May of 2012 and to establish a caretaker government in the coming weeks, which will exclude current Palestinian Prime Minister Salam Fayyad, Palestinian sources said. However, any government that includes Hamas would also be rejected by Israel, America, and the European Union, who regard Hamas as a terror organization. The United States and the European Union would recognize a unity government of Hamas and Fatah if Hamas was willing to recognize Israel and accept the terms of peace negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians that has been set forth by the quartet. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu responded by saying, the Palestinian Authority must choose between peace and Hamas. They cannot have both. Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas is expected to have a meeting with Hamas leader Khaled Mashal on November the 25th to discuss with him the implementation of their unity government agreement that was sponsored by Egypt earlier in the year. Addressing supporters in Ramallah on the anniversary of Palestinian Independence Day and the death of Yasser Arafat, Abbas said, it's our right and duty to meet with the leadership of Hamas, which represents an important part of the Palestinian people. We have the right to consult and exchange views with Hamas about the future. The future is not the business only of Fatah, the People's Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, or Hamas, these being different factions of the Palestinian people. However, Abbas said that Palestinian unity is an issue for all Palestinians. Abbas said it was time that the Palestinians ended their division and spoke in one voice. Abbas also said he would not sign any peace agreement with Israel unless all Palestinians are released from Israeli prisons. Palestinian chief negotiator Saeb Erekat commented that recognition with Hamas is a top Palestinian priority, and for us, there is no greater Palestinian interest. Ahmed Yousaf, a political advisor to Hamas Prime Minister Ismail Haniyeh, told the Jerusalem Post that the time is ripe for consensus between the two opposing Palestinian factions. The agreement over Gaza includes the possibility that the next Palestinian leader may also be a Gaza resident. From these things, we can see the significance of the decisions that are going to be made in the next week or so that's going to determine the future of the peace process. Well, this is going to conclude this week's news. Until we do it again, Shalom, in Yeshua the Messiah. Amen.